Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends, I'm updating my boss guide series with individual, more detailed explanations. This video is the second in the series and I'll cover all of the guild bosses in this style over time. If you haven't done so yet, check out the first video in the series on Sarek, the Silent King. Today's video is going to be on the Screamer Killer, one of the newer Tyranid bosses. I'll go over the abilities, how to take advantage of boss AI, insight into the side boss primes, and which characters are best, and much more. Let's dive in. The main thing to bear in mind about the Screamer Killer's kit is the Instinctive Behaviour trait. This means that if there are targets in range, the boss does not move and attacks the closest target. It's definitely worth keeping in mind, and we'll come back to it later because it's a critical element of how the boss functions and fights. The Screamer also has a melee physical attack and a ranged plasma attack at range 2. The traits are shown here on screen. The Screamer Killer follows the same template as a lot of the other bosses in the game. By that, it has 3 active and 3 passive abilities. The first active ability is Death Scream. This does plasma damage to a target enemy within 2 range and then does splash bio damage to all enemies adjacent to that initial target. It also stuns all affected units, unless you've killed the required notch on boss primes. The next active ability is Unparalleled Ferocity. This does physical damage to all enemies and is guaranteed to critical hit against summoned units. The final active ability is Living Battering Ram. This does physical damage to an enemy and stuns it. It then throws that target 2 hexes away from the Screamer Killer, and if the target lands in an occupied hex, then the unit that it lands on takes further damage. The Screamer Killer's passive abilities are simple but important too. Adrenal Surge gives the Screamer Killer an additional critical hit chance every time it defeats an enemy. In this clip on the right, you can see how the Screamer Killer's critical hit chance gets boosted massively after killing a bunch of Bloodletter summons. Blistering Assault means that the Screamer Killer's attacks, both melee and ranged, affect all enemies adjacent to the primary target. Finally, Hyper-Aggression. This allows the Screamer Killer to make a normal attack in addition to using its active on every turn from turn 2 onwards. If you watched my Sarek video, you know that I like to break down these fights by phase. So here we'll start with the opening, and there is a lot of subtle nuance to appreciate. The Screamer Killer AI is easier to understand than the other bosses. His opening behaviour first of all asks, do we have control with Synapse or are we instinctive? The Instinctive Behaviour trait makes him attack an enemy if it's within range, and sometimes the Screamer Killer will spawn with Tyranid warriors. These Tyranid warriors have the Synapse trait, and that allows the Instinctive Behaviour trait to be ignored. In these 2 clips we can see how, on the left, without any nearby Tyranid warriors, the Screamer Killer succumbs to his instinctive behaviour and makes a ranged attack while remaining stationary. Pretty straightforward. However, in the clip on the right, there is a Tyranid warrior nearby, so even though all of the other positioning is identical, the Screamer Killer does not follow instinctive behaviour and instead runs down to attack our units on the low ground. There is a pattern to the Screamer Killer AI that I'll outline here, both for when Synapse is up and when it isn't. We'll start with the most common scenario because for the opening, generally the Screamer Killer is going to have Synapse for its first turn. I've outlined on this slide the sort of flowchart behaviour that the Screamer Killer will follow. The first condition asks if the Screamer can move and attack 3 or more enemy units in melee. If the answer is yes, then the boss will move and use Unparalleled Ferocity. If that condition isn't met, then the next question it asks is, can the Screamer Killer move and attack 1 or 2 units in melee? If the answer is yes to this, then the Screamer will move and use Living Battering Ram. If neither of these conditions are met, then the Screamer Killer will move and make a ranged attack against an enemy. What about if there is no Synapse available? With Instinctive Behaviour, the rules are outlined here. It's fairly similar to the previous slide. If there are already 3 units in melee, then the Screamer Killer will use Unparalleled Ferocity. If there are 1 or 2 units in melee, then the Screamer Killer will use Living Battering Ram. And if there is a unit within 2 range, then it will use a ranged attack. If there are no units within ranged 2, then the Screamer Killer will move and repeat the logic that we saw earlier with Synapse. So specifically, it will try and move and use unparalleled ferocity if there are 3 units in melee, or it will move and use living battering ram if there are 1 or 2 units in melee, or it will try and move and use a ranged attack. For whatever reason, the Screamer Killer doesn't seem to use its Death Scream ability on turn 1. And on the topic of turn 1, remember that hyper-aggression doesn't kick in till turn 2, so the boss will only do one thing on turn 1 and then end its turn. There's one final layer to add to this opening, and that's not so much AI behavior as it is game mechanics. Essentially, units, particularly units that have larger than a 1 hex footprint, cannot straddle different elevation levels. It stays in the high ground and does unparalleled ferocity on 3 of our units instead of 5. Now that you've got the basics, you should understand how to get the Screamer onto the low ground, and every single map will have low ground somewhere. This is crucial for getting the 50% damage bonus for your units. Let's move on to the middle phase of the fight. For the middle phase of the fight, the priority is keeping the Screamer where he is, ideally on the low ground. Depending on the map you're fighting on, this might mean you have to kill the Tyranid warriors. Once you've done this, then the Screamer regains his instinctive behaviour and is much easier to handle. There are 2 approaches to this mid phase, and before we delve into that, we need to know how the boss behaves in certain conditions. This is the same instinctive behaviour pattern that we described in the opening phase, and the so-called rules are on the side of the screen. If the boss has 3 or more units in melee, then it will do unparalleled ferocity. If it has exactly 1 or 2 units in melee, then it will use living battering ram, and if there are no units in melee, this time on turn 2 onwards, the boss will use Death Scream. Additionally, because we're now on turn 2 onwards, the Screamer Killer will also then perform a normal attack, either at melee or at range, depending on what targets are available. Of the Screamer Killer's abilities, Death Scream is easily the most lethal, so we want to try and avoid any scenarios where there isn't at least 1 unit in melee. For the best results against this boss, I suggest going for the first strategy, which is where you try and get the Screamer to use unparalleled ferocity every turn. To understand why, we're going to have to take a slight sidestep to do some math. This ability, as well as the Screamer Killer's melee attack, both do physical damage. Physical damage does 1% pierce. We can apply that to the Damvar damage calculation. This is the model around which damage is dealt in Tacticus. The damage that your character takes is either the difference of damage versus armor, or damage multiplied by the pierce ratio, whichever is greater. It's pretty easy to see if we were to make our armor value very high, then damage minus armor is a negative number. Therefore, the damage that we take becomes the Screamer Killer's damage stat multiplied by 1%, which is the pierce ratio for physical damage. The Screamer's unparalleled ferocity at Legendary 3 does a range of 1107 to 1660 damage, which averages out at 1384. So if we get our unit's armor value to 1384 and the Screamer does an average attack, it ends up using its pierce ratio damage, which is 14. 14 damage for 5 hits totals to 70 damage for the entire attack, which is pretty underwhelming for a high-level boss. Now, that's all conditional on you getting your armor very high, and you might not be able to get your armor that high, particularly if you're a newer player, so I'll explain another strategy shortly. Hopefully this illustrates that in a lot of ways the Screamer Killer as a fight or as a boss is simply a stat check. If you can meet the cutoffs and get your armor high enough, either by taking your character up through gear tiers or by improving his armor, then the fight is trivial. Okay, back to the gameplay. In this clip we're using the admechs who excel against this boss. By putting our 3 admechs in melee range, the boss uses unparalleled ferocity every turn. We take barely any damage because our characters have a high gear level, but also because of Tangida's active ability, which gives bonus armor to adjacent allies. Having a high level active helps your team pass this stat check that I mentioned earlier, but sadly highlights just how much investment the mechanical team needs. If you're able to, this is the strategy that will net you the most success against this boss by quite a significant margin. What about if you don't have the admechs or you can't pass the stat check required to survive the melee physical attacks? There is a small workaround. You can try and get Actus thrown via living battering ram and leave Exeter Row in melee range and Tangida adjacent but behind him to provide a little boost of armor. This cuts down on the investment slightly and might make the fight more manageable while you're working on bringing your AdMech team up. Just don't make Actus tougher than Row, or Row will be the one getting thrown. Let's move on to the mid-game method number 2. In this method you get the Screamer Killer to throw one unit away using living Battering Ram while another unit remains in melee, taking physical damage on the second attack. You can see in this clip, which is a little bit older, how a Ragnar team might fit together. Here, Ragnar is thrown by living Battering Ram every turn, while Ulf stays in melee and uses his passive for extra out-of-turn damage. Ragnar is the ideal living Battering Ram target because his passive gives him bonus hits every time he moves into melee. This is probably the best variation or idea for the multi-hit composition, but again requires reasonably high levels to tank through all of that physical damage. A question I'm often asked is, how do you know who the Screamer Killer will prioritize if two characters are in melee range? How do you make the Screamer throw Ragnar, or for that matter anyone else? I don't have a precise answer for you, but I believe the Screamer tries to throw the unit that it can bring closest to sort of 0 health. So if there are two units with identical health, then he will throw the one that has less armor, because less armor means the Screamer does more damage, and by doing more damage the Screamer can bring the unit closer to 0 health. It's not an exact science, but that is largely the principle to apply. If you don't have the stats required even for this composition, then the best thing to do is bring along Bellator. Hopefully if you've engaged in my channel and the Dirty Dozen series, Bellator is a character that you've already leveled up. Bellator has the trait Mark 10 Gravis, which states that damage essentially has to go through armor a second time. Effectively, this doubles Bellator's armor and lets him tank the Screamer Killer particularly well. This also means that in terms of prioritizing who to throw, the Screamer will usually throw the non-Bellator target because it can bring that one closest to 0 health due to less effective armor. Well, what if you don't even have Bellator? Then I think your best bet is trying to do something like you can see here. For lack of a better phrase, I call this style dancing, essentially where you cycle your characters into and out of his throw range so that they all survive as long as possible. Now that we have run through the fight itself, the next question is what thresholds we need to kill the side boss primes. The Neurothrope generally has to be fully killed because the Barb Gaunts apply suppression to your units, and it's a big pain to have your unit's damage constantly reduced by the negative suppression debuff. For the Winged Prime there is a bit more nuance to it, particularly as the Winged Prime is a challenging side boss to kill. If you're going for mid-game method 1, where the Screamer is exclusively using unparalleled ferocity, then you don't really care about living Battering Ram. In this case, you might just want to kill the top 2 tiers of the fight, removing the Screamer's armor and allowing it to spawn fewer Hormagaunts. The Hormagaunts are slightly annoying if you have more units to kill before you can get to work on the Screamer, but they also provide you with more targets on turn 1. For example, you could conceivably finish round 1 with 2 Skitarii summons and a sniper drone because you left more targets up to attack. It's all going to depend a little bit on where you are as a guild and as an individual, but also what the map is. I could definitely see an argument for not fully clearing the Winged Prime, but generally I would recommend fully clearing the Neurothrope. What about the best characters or teams? At the moment, I think the best in-slot team for this boss is the mechanical team. Exeter Row, Tangida, Actus and Eldryon are the best core for this boss, and after that you're welcome to add either Sho or Anuphet, but I prefer the former. You just want to add more mechanical units to trigger Exeter Row, and those two work well in that role. If you don't have the mech team, then a multi-hit team is good and generally involves a core of Ragnar, Ulf, Eldryon and one more. Aethana and Onshi are both okay options. If you don't have either of those units, then you're going to want to rotate and feed your units into the juggling act of the Screamer Killer. You can do that dancing that I described in that gameplay clip earlier in this video. The Psyker team is of course unusable because the core character, the Neurothrope, is a Tyranid and therefore not usable against the Screamer boss. On the topic of useful characters, we should also discuss Big Target. Remember how I said earlier that the Screamer will always use living Battering Ram if there are 1 or 2 melee targets? Well, living battering ram causes the target to be thrown, and big targets cannot be thrown, so effectively they function as solo tanks for this boss. Rayvas is good in this particular tanking role, and you could bring Aleph Null or another mechanical character to keep healing Rayvas and letting her tank. The trouble with this strategy is that when they aren't thrown, they take an extra 20% maximum health as bonus damage, so you really need to have strong and capable healers to keep your tanking unit alive. There isn't really a best-in-slot machine of war against this boss at the moment. I suppose the Malleus battery could theoretically give you a small boost through its ranged summons, but the AdMech team does so much damage on its own that you tend not to really notice the additional guardsmen around the side. As a Tyranid boss, the Biovore isn't usable anyway. There you go, hopefully a short and sweet guide to the Screamer Killer. I hope that was useful and covered the main points. I want to thank and acknowledge Aarons, Tawan, and Hito Nagashi from Bloody Rose for their help and insights with the script and video. I've left my referral code up on the screen here. If you are a newer player, I'd love it if you could consider entering it. It will earn you 100 Blackstone and support me in the work that I do. It is single use though, so choose who you support carefully. Bye for now.